What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the camera setup of the Cricut Innovate E5G and going over whether or not it's good enough for daily use. Now, this is probably going to be a relatively short one because, as you can see here, this phone doesn't have nearly as many different cameras as a lot of the other phones I do these videos for. But despite this, as you're about to see, the photo quality itself is actually quite a bit different than you might expect. So we're going to look at some photo and video samples from this phone to give you a better idea of whether or not this camera is going to be good enough for you. Now, as always, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and in case you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So as always, I want to start out with the selfie camera. Taking a look at this camera, we got a typical water drop notch design. Nothing really out of the ordinary here. Most phones in this price range are going to have the same exact look. And this camera is 5 megapixels, so again, it's definitely not bad for what it is, but it's also not really anything different from what you might be used to seeing. Now, to give you an idea of what this camera can do, here's a photo taken with it using portrait mode. Pretty typical indoor setting here, decent lighting, nothing too crazy, and I'm gonna guess for the vast majority of people, when you're taking selfies, you're probably gonna be in a pretty similar environment, so essentially, this is what it's gonna look like. Of course, on one hand, if you're comparing it to a really high-end phone, a camera like this is not gonna be nearly as good, and even compared to another lower-end phone like the Samsung Galaxy A13 LTE, for example, which is really not that much more expensive than this phone, if at all, the photo quality really isn't that much different. In fact, I would say the A13 LTE is arguably even a bit better. But that being said, on the other hand, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, the photo quality with this selfie camera really isn't bad. In fact, as you can see, the portrait mode actually works pretty well. So while you're probably not going to be doing any serious mobile photography with this camera, if you're just taking the occasional photo here and there, maybe to share on social media, for example, I do think you will get a decent experience here. And in general, as far as the photo quality goes, again, it looks nice, portrait mode works really well, and I honestly don't really have any complaints. So as you could probably tell from that, despite this being a really low-end affordable phone, it's not like one of those cheap phones with terrible selfie cameras. It is definitely usable. So whether you're taking selfies you want to keep, or you're just using something like Snapchat where the quality doesn't even matter at all, despite obviously not being the best in the world, for what it is, the Cricut Innovate E5G will definitely get the job done. Now, moving on to the rear camera setup, like I said before, this setup is really simple with not a whole lot to it. So we go to dual camera here with the 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So of course, compared to a lot of the slightly upper end entry level phones, the Cricut Innovate E5G is definitely going to be lacking in some features. So with no macro camera, no ultra wide camera, not really a whole lot of anything. If you're really taking a lot of photos, I honestly wouldn't recommend this phone because an ultra wide camera and a macro camera, those are really useful features. They give you a lot of flexibility in the way you're able to take photos. So if you're really taking a lot of photos and that's one of the main things you're doing with your phone, then I would definitely get a different device that has more features. But that being said, despite everything, this phone does have surprisingly good image quality. So as you can see from these test photos, while some of them are definitely better than others, overall I do think the quality is pretty good here. The colors and everything look really nice, and honestly the details are quite a bit better than I expected. When it comes to lower end phones like this, two things I've noticed quite a bit are, first of all, things tend to look a little bit grainy, and this obviously makes the picture look quite a bit lower quality and definitely not good enough for something like social media. But with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we're really not getting that here. Everything is super sharp and the way it focuses is really nice. Keep in mind I'm not using portrait mode in any of these photos yet, and everything does look really nice and professional. In general, with a little editing to spice up the colors, I could definitely imagine sharing some of these photos on social media. Now, all this being said, a lot of this is really going to depend on your expectations. Because on one hand, if you're coming from an older flagship phone, for example, like say a Samsung Galaxy S10, this phone is not going to be nearly at that level. Flagship phones, even an older one like that, is still in a completely different league. So if you have a phone like that and you get a phone like this, definitely don't expect the same photo quality. But on the other hand, if you have more realistic expectations, or maybe you're coming from a really low-end phone like a Cricut debut type thing, if you're in that kind of situation, I do think this phone will work out decently well for you. And even for most people, I feel like a lot of people think they need a much higher quality camera than they actually do. Because at the end of the day, if you're just posting pictures on Instagram, for example, or maybe just sending things to friends and family, using stuff like Snapchat, that kind of thing really doesn't need a super high quality camera. Most of the social media platforms are going to be compressing things anyway, so on a lot of these platforms, even if you took a picture with a DSLR, it's only really going to be marginally better. Now, of course, this doesn't really apply to everyone. If you're a content creator, for example, then yeah, sure, you're probably going to want the best quality you can absolutely get. But again, for the average user, if you're just taking a couple photos here and there and really nothing else, then honestly, the photo quality you get with the Cricut Innovate E5G is going to be perfectly fine. Now in case you're wondering, here's some photos taken using portrait mode. Just like with the selfie camera, portrait mode works really well in the rear, and of course portrait mode is going to be great for something like Instagram for example. So again, for more casual social media users, I do think the Cricut Innovate E5G will work out really well. Now when it comes to video, this phone is pretty much about what you would expect for a phone in this price range. On one hand, it's definitely not terrible, but on the other hand, if you're more of a content creator, or even if you're just making a lot of TikToks or Reels or something like that, I probably wouldn't use this phone for that. With this phone, we have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so good news is, you can actually record 1080p selfie videos. That's not always going to be the case for phones in this price range. But that being said, the downside to the video quality here is it's definitely not anything spectacular, and I feel like when you're making videos, if you're making them for something like social media where you actually want to share them, the bar for videos is a little bit higher than it is for photos, and with this phone, the video quality is again not terrible, but at the same time, it's not really that impressive. Another thing I didn't really like about the video on this phone is that it didn't have autofocus, or at least I couldn't get it to work. And when you're recording a video, especially a more interactive one like a vlog for example, that's definitely something you're going to want to have. Now I've never actually used a phone that didn't have autofocus for the video, so maybe I was just doing something wrong, but honestly if I have to try to get the autofocus to work, then the video recording for the phone just really isn't that good. But aside from that, I do think the image quality itself is at least decent. Now would I recommend this phone if you're making a lot of videos you want to share somewhere? Probably not, but for the Snapchat principle, if you're really just making videos where the quality doesn't even matter, then it's still going to be fine, and it still is significantly better than a lot of other entry-level phones. Now of course, another important element of video is the audio quality, so take a look at this next clip to get an idea of what it sounds like. Here's a test video with the Cricut Innovate E5G. We are recording in 1080p right now. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. Now keep in mind the actual audio is really loud, I had to turn it down quite a bit, but in general I guess that is a plus side. A lot of these phones are really quiet when you're recording videos, but as you could probably tell, honestly the audio quality itself really wasn't very good. So at the end of the day, if you're recording videos like TikToks or something, or even just making an Instagram story, you're probably not going to get the best experience with this phone because I'm not really a big fan of the audio quality, and in general if that really is a concern for you, you can definitely do better. But in conclusion, does the Cricut Innovate E5G have a good enough camera setup for daily use? In general, that's really going to depend entirely on what you're doing with it. While again, this phone is lacking a lot of features that are really useful if you're taking a lot of photos, if you're just taking a few selfies here and there, and then normal photos, maybe using portrait mode from time to time, then I do think the photo quality itself is going to be plenty good enough for you. Sure, it's not going to be amazing like a really high-end flagship phone, and if you're a content creator, then I feel like not having an ultra-wide camera or macro camera is going to be a deal breaker anyway. But considering that again, this is a really entry-level phone that you might even end up getting for free, the Cricut Innovate E5G does actually take really nice photos for what it is. That being said though, when it comes to video, I honestly can't say the same. While again it's not terrible, it's really not that useful. I don't really like the audio quality, and sure, maybe you could make a couple soundless Instagram stories with it, but really if you're doing anything else, especially something with audio, and that's actually an important thing for you, then you're probably going to want to go for a different device that can record better videos. So at the end of the day, the Cricut Innovate E5G is a really basic device with a really basic camera setup, but I will admit, aside from the video quality, despite not having a ton of features, this phone does take much better photos than I expected. But this concludes my camera review of the Cricut Innovate E5G. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories, so definitely check that out. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.